Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, which is on council tax reduction. As you can see from the slide, we've got three speakers. We've got Karen, my colleague at entitledto, who's going to talk about our 26-27 council tax reduction survey, and we've got Rita and Marsha from University of Bath Institute for Policy Research, who are going to talk about their research into council tax reduction. So we've got about 35 of you in at the moment. We had something like 80 of you register, so we'll probably expect a few more. We won't get quite up to 80, but we'll get a bit closer, so we'll start in a moment. I just need to cover a couple of housekeeping bits. The first is to say that this webinar will be recorded, and we will send out the recording and the slides after the meeting. I should also say now, as well as the slides which Karen is going to do, we do a longer report into CTR trends this year, and we also do a live document. So we've got a live document on income banded schemes and data sets and things like that. So if you are interested in having a lot more detail, get in contact with us afterwards, but we will send the slides out. And we'll send the recording out. And then the other thing to say is, with questions and answers, if you've got any questions, you can raise your hand if you want to speak, which is always nice, and the presenter will stop and answer them, or you can use the chat function, or you can use the Q&A function. We've got quite a lot to get through, so I think what we'll probably try and do is save all the questions to the end, but there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to Karen at the end of her bit. Karen will go first, and then it'll be Rita and Marsha. Okay, we've got about 50 of you in now, so I think I will hand over now to Karen, and if you take us through your bit, Karen, and if you think that you've got something like half an hour, and then we'll have a little pause, see if there's any questions, then hand over to Rita and Marsha. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks, Phil. Yep, so we're here to have a look at the review of council tax reduction schemes that are in operation this year. So this is working age council tax reduction schemes across England. So as we did last year, it's because we've got a mix of knowledge levels on the webinar, just a few key terms that we'll be using throughout this session and what they mean, so we can all be in the same page. So for the last 13 years, local authorities have set their own localised CTR schemes for working age claimants, and these are some of the key features that we monitor for this review. So we've got the minimum payment, which is the amount, regardless of a claimant's circumstance, that they must pay towards their council tax liability. And the other half of that is the maximum CTR, the maximum support that the local authority will offer you help with. And in most cases, these are expressed as percentages. There's also income disregard. So this could be a specific type of benefit, like a disability benefit, or it could be an earnings disregard, an amount that you can earn before your CTR is reduced. There's band caps. So these are a different way of restricting the support that you can receive. So in some areas, there might be, for example, a band D cap, and that means that you can't receive support with a liability higher than that of a band D property. Non-dependent deductions are an amount that is assumed that non-dependents living with you will be able to help you with towards your council tax. So that's taken off your support. And capital limits. This is the maximum amount that you can have in capital and remain eligible for your CTR scheme. So now we've got the key features covered. If we move on to just the top level headlines of this year's review. So we've got 17% of local authorities in England have made changes to the way they calculate CTR this year, and that's 51 out of a total of 296 local authorities in England. It's a relief to say that the most common changes were to increase the maximum support this year and or increase the income disregards. So that specific one is mostly in relation to income banded schemes disregarding extra elements of UC, which is something we'll look at in more detail. So after last year's slightly more depressing review, this year a slightly more positive note. And we've got 10 new income banded schemes. So every year we look at how many new income banded schemes we have. 10 is a significant slowdown compared to recent years, which may be the start of a trend. 43% of CTR schemes are now income banded. And just to say that all the data we use in our review is based on the published CTR scheme by each local authority up to the beginning of this week, 18th of May. So what changes have we got? So we've got 51 local authorities made changes, but local authorities will tend to make more than one change at a time. So individual changes, we're looking at almost 100. And this is just a quick breakdown that 65 of those changes tended towards increasing support available for claimants, and 34 were towards decreasing support for claimants. So individually, if we remember those key features that we spoke about before, the way to increase support is to increase a capital limit, perhaps raise a band cap or remove a band cap that was previously in place, and obviously increase the maximum support available within your scheme. So there's some of the things that local authorities have done this year to increase support. If we look at the type of things they've done to decrease support, we've got reducing the maximum support available in the scheme, reducing the capital limits, so fewer people can qualify if they have often modest amounts of savings. And we can reduce earnings disregard and increase minimum awards. We'll go into each of these features in a bit more detail later. So one of the key things that we like to see is how many CTR schemes still offer up to 100% support with council tax. You can see here we've followed the trends from 2013 when it was first localised right up until this year. And after a slight dip last year, we're back on the up again. So we've actually got more schemes providing 100% relief this year since it was first localised. So we've got 117. But as I mentioned band caps previously, 27 of these schemes that offer up to 100% do actually have a band cap as well. So they're restricting the support available in a different mechanism. But 117 schemes offer up to 100% support. And for income banded, that means they offer it in their band 1, their highest support level. So the poorest claimants usually can get into band 1 and get that 100% support. So if your scheme doesn't have 100% support, then it means you've got to make a minimum payment. And what this chart's showing you is the most common minimum payments within schemes this year. So historically, it's usually been in the 20 to 29% that you have to pay towards your council tax. But actually this year, it's most common to have a minimum payment of 0, offering that 100%. We had a bit of a surge last year of higher minimum payments, expecting more than 30%, 40, 50% contributions towards council tax from all claimants, regardless of circumstance. And that was based predominantly in London and the South East. We've not seen this trend continue at the same pace. We've had just 3 new minimum payments of 30% or more this year. So we specifically wanted to highlight North Somerset because they've increased their minimum payment. They're 32.5% now, but they're also one of the councils that was given approval to increase their council tax rates beyond the 5% cap. So their council tax rates went up by 8.99% at the same time as the minimum payment in their scheme has been increased as well. So low income claimants in that area, particularly because they have no vulnerable groups, no protected groups, will actually be facing a double whammy of a higher bill and lower support at the same time. And just to reiterate how banded schemes are slightly different in getting that maximum support from your scheme. So when we look at maximum support, we use the highest support available. So that's the one that gets you into band 1. And what actually gets you into band 1 varies significantly across banded schemes. It'll depend if they have any protections for vulnerable groups or if they automatically place certain people into band 1, or you need to get your income below the upper income threshold of band 1. So just to indicate a bit of the variety available here, I've looked at 12 earnings only schemes. They're all the same format and they all only use earnings. So it was the simplest direct comparison. And out of these 12 schemes, in 4 of them, you have to have 0 earnings to be awarded the maximum support. So the image here you're seeing is one of those schemes. You have to have 0 monthly earned income to get the maximum support of 70% in this local authority. As soon as you earn your first pound, because there's no earnings disregards, you drop to 50% support. For the other 8 schemes, low-income workers can receive maximum support if their income falls under the upper income threshold, and they range from £21 a week up to £96 a week. Again, out of them 8, only 3 have earnings disregard, so there's still quite modest levels of income to get into that band 1 to get the maximum support. And often in banded schemes, there's a significant cliff edge, so there'll be a significant drop in support once you leave band 1. So if we start looking through the other features that were mentioned before, so what's going on with band caps this year? So these are the ones that restrict the maximum liability you can get help with. And we've got 98 schemes that have a band cap in 26-27. And same as usual, the picture doesn't really change on band caps. The most common is band D and has historically always been band D. We do get some changing, flipping between bands, but the picture usually looks like this. For non-dependent deductions, just a little focus here on those that differ from the prescribed rates. So we've got 187 schemes that have made changes to their approach to how they deal with non-dependent deductions. That could be that they have fewer or more different rates of non-dependent deduction, or it could be simply that they've increased the rates of non-dependent deduction beyond those prescribed in the default scheme. It's almost twice as likely for a banded scheme to alter its approach to non-dependent deductions than a non-banded scheme. And we can see here that I've picked out some of the key things. So flat rates, 2 rates, and removing them completely in the chart. So 52 income banded schemes have removed non-dependent deductions completely. This is a move to simplify administration of their scheme, but only 3 non-banded schemes have done that. A smaller proportion have streamlined their non-dependent deductions. So we've got 33 schemes have a flat rate in non-banded schemes, or have 2 rates compared to 60 banded schemes. The flat rate, again, it's a pretty stagnant picture. The most popular is £10. We look at earnings disregards, as we mentioned in the previous slide about the upper income thresholds to get into these support bands. And in some of them, no earnings disregard is awarded. So it's more usual for income banded schemes to vary their approach to this. This year we have 8 non-banded schemes with a flat rate earnings disregard, whereas 45% of banded schemes have a flat rate. You can see from the chart the most popular flat rate earnings disregard is £25. There seems to be no consensus on whether these should also be applied to UC claimants, so some will apply them and some won't. I think it depends on the local authorities' either opinion or experience of the earnings information they get from DWP and whether the work allowance within UC has already been applied or not. Some feel that to offer earnings disregard would be to be offering them to, and some still offer them to UC claimants. We have 32 income banded schemes who've removed earnings disregards completely, compared to only one non-banded scheme. Capital limits, so one of our final features to look at. We've got 314 schemes that in total, because some of the 296 authorities have more than one scheme. And this year, 167 of them have retained 16,000 as the upper capital limit, the amount that if your savings go over, you won't be entitled to council tax reduction. Banded schemes are far less likely to have retained that 16,000 limits. Only 32% of banded schemes have retained 16,000. If it's going to be decreased, the most common approach is to decrease it to 6,000. There's a handful changing it to 12, 10, 8, and a couple have gone below 6,000. So you can only have 3,000 or 4,000 capital before you fall out of entitlement for CTR. The other aspect to do with capital limits isn't just about who qualifies for CTR, it's about a tariff income, so an assumed income from that capital and the way that works. This year, we've got 134 schemes that have no tariff income rule. So some of them is because they've reduced their capital limits to 6,000, so that they've got a low cutoff and they're no longer having to calculate tariff income on savings between the 6,000 and the 16 because it doesn't exist anymore. Others have just written it out of their scheme. Again, this is an administrative simplification, which is why this would be changed. Minimum CTR awards, the final one of our features that we're going to look at. So this is when your CTR entitlement's been calculated, but the scheme has placed a minimum on it. So if your entitlement is calculated at £4 a week, but they have a minimum award of £5, you simply won't receive any of that entitlement. Your award will be zero. There are 64 schemes that have a minimum award. And the most common is to set it at £1. So by removing these very small amounts, it means they save on the administration costs of processing these awards. And obviously the impact on these claimants is less significant because the awards were smaller in the first place. £5 is the next highest, most common minimum award, which obviously would have a greater impact on people to lose out on those amounts of under £5 a week. Right, so growth of income banded schemes. As I said, we look at this each year and this has slowed this year. So there was only 10 new income banded schemes. It's a 50% downturn on last year. But it does mean we've now got a total of 137 income banded schemes, which is almost 44%. Just a quick image here to show that we have these two types. We have non-banded and income banded, and we've referred to these throughout the sessions so far because they do have different approaches to the features that we monitor. So the main difference for UC claimants is that if you're in a non-banded scheme, they use the full UC award, your maximum UC, as your applicable amount. It says this claimant needs this much, and then they use the same universal credit award or how much you receive of it as your income, and they compare them. So they take all of your UC award into account as income, but because it's being compared against your maximum UC, it balances. It's on both sides of the calculation. And if your award is the same as your maximum UC, you have no excess income. So you can receive your full support, whatever that might be in that authority. Income banded schemes don't have applicable amounts. They don't generate a need for the claimant in the same way. So they must choose how much of the UC award to count as income because there's nothing to balance it off against. In doing that, they do have decisions to make which have been problematic for some income banded schemes. They not only have to decide which of these elements they count as income, but they need to decide on ways to protect people who are carers, are disabled people, because we've got no need to balance it against. We need to put other protections in place for those claimants. So once an income banded scheme has got the income it's going to take into account, it then compares it to an income table. So these are 3 examples of the most common income banded tables you will see. So the first one there has 4 household types, splitting into families with 1 child, families with 2+ children, and the next most common has 6. It separates those families into single people with 1 or more children and couples with 1 or more children, so they can be slightly more tailored. And then the third common approach is to have a one-size-fits-all, which suits earnings-only schemes the best, as obviously it doesn't distinguish between need at all. There are 39 schemes that don't fall into that one of those formats. They've gone and created a format of their own. So some of them will want you to take into account larger families. So they might go up to 3, 4, 5, 6 children, so have extra household types. Some of them have just gone, we're not going to take children into account, it's singles and couples, but this year we've got an extra one which is singles and couples, and then singles and couples under 25. And then there's some that vary by protected groups. So there'll be a household format for disabled people and carers, and one for non-protected perhaps. But within these variations, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different ways to do that thing. This isn't one type of thing for larger families. This is 19 local authorities doing 19 different things for larger families. So that's the point to stress here. And we had 7 existing local income banded schemes that changed their format this year. So 2 of them reduced to just being a single couple household type from having either a 4 or 6 types of households covering children and families. And that's because they've decided to disregard more of the UC. They're only taking into account the standard allowance. So they could refine their household types just down to singles and couples. Others have changed to allow more children, and this is in response to the 2-child limit being lifted in UC and the impact that's had on income banded schemes. So we've got some that now cover up to 4, 5, 8, and one covers an unlimited number of children, the way they've organised their scheme. So let's just have a look at the lifting of the 2-child limit and why that has caused the need for a reaction from CTR schemes. So we have the lifting of 2-child limit means an extra £303.94 per month included in your maximum UC for every child affected. Now, if you remember, in non-banded schemes, the maximum UC is your applicable amount. So that will also go up by the number of child elements you have. So although you've got extra income in UC, you've got that balance, if you remember the image before, and you won't be impacted by the lifting of the 2-child limit because the calculation is balanced. In income banded schemes, they don't have that, and they're most commonly designed to treat larger families the same as those with 2 children. So if you look at those common formats, it's families with 1 child, families with 2+ children. They all fall into the same income range. Now, an additional £303.94 a month in your UC is enough to push you into another income band, if not out of the scheme completely. So this is where the lifting of the 2-child limit has been problematic for income banded schemes that take the child element into account as income. And this is a scheme, a slide from last year, but I just wanted to show the point of this example was a lone parent who was unemployed and caring for 2 children. And just with their standard allowance and 2 child elements, they had £226.85 per week. And looking at the income banded schemes, that would have put them in band 2 in some schemes, and it would have pushed them into band 3 in others. If we put an extra child element on there or an extra few child elements, you could see that that person would easily fall out of entitlement or fall into the very lowest levels of entitlement. So let's look at the type of incomes income banded schemes do take into account. We've kind of focused on two extremes. Some are earnings only, so they're not going to look at any of your UC, so they avoid this problem. But there's about a fifth of schemes are earnings only. 8 of them are excess income. So if you recall the applicable amount and the income being balanced, they do that calculation and then they take the excess income and then compare that to an income table again. That approach means they've been protected by a lot of these issues with UC income taken into account as well, because they still do the applicable amount and balance the income that way. The majority of these schemes, 70% of them, are, as was explained, they need to look at the UC income and decide how much of that they're going to take into account. So we've got 96 schemes with potential issues around which elements of the UC award they count as income. If we look at what they are disregarding, you can see that the majority, 93 of them, disregard the housing element. Why a local authority would decide to take the help with someone's rent and use it as income in their council tax reduction calculation, when historically that's never been the case, is uncertain. I don't know why 3 of them are still doing that, but you can see that the majority acknowledge that housing support has always been a disregarded income in council tax benefits and now into council tax reduction schemes. We can see from the legal challenges, which I'll come into in a moment, I think have inspired some local authorities to disregard transitional protection element. So last year, we only had about 4 disregarding transitional protection element, but we've had an extra 18 this year, which is a huge jump for an element that's traditionally been ignored completely when it comes to writing these policies. So to have an extra 18 disregarding it this year can only be a result, I think, of the challenges of Three Rivers scheme. And hopefully that will go up next year when people have had a chance to actually consult and change their scheme, because the timing of that decision was a bit late. Similarly, Somerset's scheme was challenged on the basis of including limited capability for work-related activity, which is the equivalent of ESA support. And we've got 11 local authorities newly disregarding that element. It was one of the higher. It was one of the ones that was most commonly disregarded if they were going to disregard other elements, but it's good to see more doing that. So there's 54 of these 96 now disregard that higher level disability element as well. If we move on, we'll just have a quick look. I'm not going to read you the slide, but this is just an overview of what those legal challenges were. So in Three Rivers, it was because they were wrongly treating transitional protection as surplus income. Their claimant moved from ESA, where they were getting full support, onto UC. They're in a UC banded scheme where the local authority had to decide which elements to take into account as income, and they decided they were going to keep the transitional protection as income. And because of that decision on its own, this claimant was faced with a much larger bill than they had originally. This was challenged, and the council decided to amend their scheme to ensure that anyone who'd been disadvantageously affected would have the impact mitigated. And the hope is that other CTR schemes that are taking the transitional protection element into account as income will follow place. Like I said, because of the timings, most couldn't consult and get their schemes changed in time for 26-27. They might need to use Section 13 relief if people challenge them on this to mitigate against their losses until they can actually change their schemes for 27-28. And the Somerset challenge is very similar. So that was the LCWRA element, and the claim is that there's discriminatory structural flaws in the design of the scheme by the decision to take into account that disability element as income, which again led to this person moving from ESA to UC and being hit with a much larger bill because of the types of income they were taking into account. And I've reached the end. I didn't think I'd get there, and it's past, so I've done well. But I do know there's some questions that have popped up. So Phil, do you want to give me a rundown?
If I'm pronouncing Kitab's name correctly, he asked, as you know, increases to the child element of UC when to 3 usually trigger the benefit cap. I don't know if usually is correct, but they certainly can trigger the benefit cap. What happens then as the child element increases, but the benefit cap means that their income doesn't increase?
Well, if their income doesn't increase, then it's not going to affect their CTR award because that's based on the income you get from UC, and the cap obviously restricts the income that you can get from UC. It is correct that if you are not exempt from the cap through being disabled or working over 16 hours or having the earnings equivalent to working over 16 hours, then the gains you would make from the 2-child limit being lifted would be minimal. In most areas, especially if you've got help with your rent going into your UC as well, it's easier to hit that cap. So you may not benefit from getting the additional child elements. But for those who do, it's a significant increase in income.
Okay, so just to check, if your child element, the getting rid of the cap means getting rid of the 2-child benefit cap, means that you then become benefit capped. The small upside might be that your CTR award might not be too much effective. But if you receive a 3rd child element or a 4th child element and you don't hit the benefit cap, then in a banded scheme, your CTR award is likely to go down.
In a banded scheme that treats child element as income, which is the majority of those 96, we're not talking about earnings only schemes. And like I said, excess income banded schemes are different. But of those 96 that are treating, if they're treating child element as income and you're not capped, you are going to most likely lose a lot or all of your CTR.
Very much. Okay, I will resist the temptation to ask about those income banded schemes which have kept the LCWRA in their income. And I will say to anyone else who's got questions, if we have time, we'll take some more questions at the end. But right now, I'm going to hand over to Rita and Marsha, and they're going to talk about their research. So take it away, Rita.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good to be presenting today. Marsha, could you, excuse me, load slides?
Good to see. Can you see them yet?
Not yet. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking today with my colleague Marsha Wood about some research that we've recently completed looking at the interaction between council tax reduction. Some people who can't see the slides.
I think
let me try and...
I think they are working. I think if their colleagues just wait a couple of moments.
I'll try sharing again because I got a message saying it wasn't working from my end.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Can you see them, Rita?
I did.
Oh, right, okay, I can see them now.
They've
And then
disappeared
hopefully
now.
People can see them now.
I can't.
We've got a thumbs up. That's good.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Good. Great.
Oh, good. Share.
Sorry, I can't see them now. No, I can't see them.
Did you have them, Phil? Should I stop sharing?
I do. I was just going to say that. I was just waiting for that moment. Okay. So
okay, I'll stop sharing and I'll let you share them, Phil. And hopefully that'll be better.
And
yeah,
let me go to here. And hopefully in just a moment it'll come up there. And if I go to there, can everyone now see those slides?
I can.
Yeah, if you just start the slideshow. Yeah,
Okay.
great.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can move the, sorry, I'm going to have to tell you to move the slide on, Phil,
Yeah.
if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is this research. I'll quickly go through the aims of the research, what we're looking at, the methods that we used, and then just quickly going through headline findings, and then some policy reform options as well. I should say that our report is due for publication in a couple of weeks' time. It will be available online, and anybody that's taken the time to come along today will be contacted. They'll get a copy of that. So yeah, watch out for the launch. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I won't recap on what Karen's already said, but council tax reduction schemes were introduced alongside the introduction of universal credit as council tax benefit was withdrawn. So introduced in 2013, and as universal credit has rolled out over that decade plus, virtually everybody who gets council tax reduction is now on universal credit. I mean, a few people remaining who are on legacy benefits or tax credits, but very, very few. And I do believe by July this year, everybody will have been moved across from the legacy system. But the point being that not everybody who's on universal credit gets council tax reduction because of all the different eligibility and entitlement processes that Karen has outlined. So every council has its own scheme, has its own rules, and that will determine the extent to which people on universal credit are or are not entitled to get it. And it's been called a postcode lottery, a very overused term, but it actually really does sum up in a very neat way the way in which universal credit interacts with council tax reduction. We can have the next slide, please. Okay. So our focus was actually on people who were getting universal credit and had somebody in the household who was earning, because very little is known about this group of people. And we wanted to understand how they experience universal credit. So it was qualitative research. We did have a survey element to it, which Marsh is going to talk about, but the focus was on just finding out how people were experiencing getting or not getting council tax reduction, and how they were financially affected by it. And in particular, we were looking at the way in which the different elements of schemes around different application processes and the different eligibility entitlement criteria, different income and earnings thresholds, how they were actually affecting people in real life settings. Next slide, please. So what we did was to do an online survey, and we did it in partnership with entitledto. So as people went on to find out what their benefit calculations might be, whether they were entitled to council tax research, people could sign up to the online survey. And we had 160 people who were universal credit claimants who completed the survey. And from that group, we asked if people were interested in taking part in a telephone interview, and we succeeded in interviewing 30 people from that group of survey respondents. We also did interviews with some local authority officers who were closely involved in the design and delivery of council tax schemes locally. And we conducted our research between May and October 2025. So some of the findings are a little bit out of date in terms of the changes that Karen's been talking about. We were focusing on the scheme as was in 2025 to 26, rather than the changes that have recently been introduced. Next slide, please. So our headline findings. So The point about localising council tax reduction was to allow local authorities to prioritise their local needs and priorities, to design schemes according to what they consider to be important in their own areas. But they were also meant to focus on, as far as possible, on helping universal credit objectives in terms of helping people into work and increase their earnings. And what we found is that over the period since 2013, as the funding pressures on councils have intensified. I mean, the scheme was never fully funded when it was first introduced. There was already a cut compared with the council tax benefit, and over the years the funding has gradually reduced. It's not ring fenced in the same way as provision for people of state pension age is, and so gradually the schemes have refocused their attention on the most vulnerable and the poorest claimants or people in their areas. The flip side of that being that the availability and generosity of help for people who are in work has gradually reduced as more vulnerable residents get the highest levels of support. So this loss for people who are either earning or have a partner who is earning in the household, it's been reflected in terms of increasing taper rates for the kind of traditional or default schemes, removal or reduction in the earnings disregards. Karen was making reference to some of those. And loss of entitlement, sometimes at very low levels of earnings, again, reflecting what Karen was saying. Also, year-on-year freezes in entitlement as well, which amounts to a reduction over time. And what's happened is that for people who do have earnings, even at very low levels, which means that they qualify for help with universal credit, they're increasingly unlikely to qualify for help for council tax reduction, or the amount of reduction that they're entitled to has been decreasing over time. And that's pushed up levels of arrears among this group of people, and also reducing council tax rates as well. And a great quote from one of our informants: you get into a doom loop where people are not paying in year, they move to the next year, they're still not paying the previous year, they're not able to pay that, and then the cycle just repeats. You just end up with this vast swathe of council tax arrears that's never going to be recovered. So there are some real dilemmas for local authorities here about how they design their schemes. Next slide, please. The other key finding is just the extent to which the different schemes are hugely variable in terms of their application processes and in the rules applying to eligibility and entitlement. Very fragmented across England. In terms of application processes, some local authorities have an automated process where as soon as somebody claims universal credit, it automatically triggers a claim for council tax reduction. But many councils still require a separate application for council tax reduction, and obviously that impacts on take-up rates. Not everybody knows there is a scheme in their area, and a lot of people who are in work assume that they're not entitled to it. And yet the Universal Credit Data Share, the UCDS, which all councils receive, provides all the validation that councils actually need around ID, the kind of the capital, the savings that people have, and also their income and earnings, but not all of them actually incorporate that into their schemes. And then, as Karen was outlining in quite a lot of detail, just the diversity in the set of rules around capital limits, maximum support, minimum support, earnings disregards, what income is disregarded in terms of universal credit elements, how self-employed earnings are treated, huge variety depending on which local authority you happen to live on. Added to the complexity, a lot of areas use household types and council tax band as well. So this huge variety, this postcode lottery, is actually undermining the way in which social security has historically worked, which is that it's based on needs, that it's fair and consistent for people in similar sets of circumstances. So another great quote, it's almost like you franchise something and you go in one and you get a level of service, you'd expect it in another, but that franchise is run very differently. And this shouldn't be the case when you're dealing with people's lives, when you're dealing with people's finances and whether they can afford their bills. Next slide, please. And we found that neither the default scheme nor the income banded schemes actually worked well with universal credit. So default schemes have are very reactive to the monthly assessment in universal credit, so it can create huge variability in the amount of entitlement that people get, and a huge administrative demand on councils that have to reissue the council tax reduction amount, and often changing direct debits for people. So it's creating a huge amount of income volatility for claimants. On the other hand, income banded schemes have huge variability in what's treated as income, and they can have cliff edges at the income thresholds, where people actually lose more in council tax reduction than they actually gain in the extra income that they get through earnings. And as Karen outlined as well, it can open up people to legal challenges of discrimination, councils. And also, as far as universal credit is concerned, it's creating financial penalties to working and earning more, but precisely the type of work disincentives universal credit was meant to eliminate. So I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Marsh, who's going to talk about the survey in a bit more detail. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Rita. So as Rita mentioned earlier, we conducted an online survey through that people could access through the Entitled to benefit calculator, and that was self-completed by 160 universal credit claimants who were in paid work or self-employment and who had either current or recent experience of receiving or applying for council tax reduction. So of the 160, 94 of them were currently receiving the council tax reduction, and 66 had received it in the past 12 months, but they were no longer entitled due to their earnings. So all were working when they were in receipt of or applying for the council tax reduction. So in the survey, we included some sort of more structured questions, and then we also gave some options for kind of like more free text answers. So I'm just going to, if you can go to the next slide, please, Phil. I'm just going to go through a few of the findings from the survey. So first, just in relation to key issues about council tax reduction and council tax affordability. So the vast majority of those who responded were struggling to pay their council tax in spite of getting council tax reduction. So 76% of those who were receiving some council tax reduction were struggling, compared with 86% of those who were no longer entitled. The average monthly amount of council tax respondents were liable to pay after getting their council tax reduction was £129, and the median was £127, and amounts ranged from £0 to as high as £315. A large share of those who responded were in council tax arrears, so 44% of those currently receiving their council tax reduction were in council tax arrears, and 56% of those who were no longer entitled were in arrears. And the average amount that they owed was £1,490, the median being £800, but the range was between £50 and went up to as high as £6,000. So around a third said that the amount that they had to pay varied each month. So that made it really difficult for them to budget and really burdensome to manage. And so regardless of how much council tax reduction they got, almost all respondents said that the council tax reduction was very important, and this was because they had such little disposable income to afford high council tax bills. So they felt that any help was better than getting no help at all. Next slide, please. And in terms of some of the experiences of council tax reduction that they reported in the survey, so for around half said that getting council tax reduction while being on universal credit had been terrible or quite bad. And when giving free text responses, the key reasons were around the sort of additional administrative burden that they'd experienced when claiming. Delays was a big issue that came up quite a lot, having variable monthly entitlements, again, so making it really difficult to budget, the low amount of reduction and the loss of reduction in council tax, loss of council tax reduction when working, that's also a big issue. So almost half said that they found it difficult to apply for council tax reduction. So key reasons were low levels of awareness, and for some, really onerous application processes, including having to sort of provide and upload documentary evidence, limited support and poor communication, so not being able to speak with anyone or get in touch or get communication back about their issues they were having with their claim. But those who have more positive experiences mentioned having high and more stable council tax reduction amounts, simple online applications and automated processes linked to their universal credit claim. But we also found that few actually kind of knew if or understood how their council tax reduction actually interacted with their universal credit. So it's kind of not really well understood how that was really working. And we asked about if anyone had any suggestions for improvements. So many said that basically increasing the entitlement to council tax reduction when working was most important thing. Others said improving or automating the application processes. Others said better support and communication. And in the report, when you see it, there'll be other suggestions there as well, but those were the main ones. And there were mixed views on whether council tax reduction should be integrated with the universal credit award. So some wanted to revert back to direct payments, as with the legacy council tax benefit for the unemployed. But many were reticent, so they saw that there was a risk in doing this because there's so many competing elements on the sort of universal credit. There was a risk of that the council tax element would be used for other things. So I'm going to hand back to Rita now to talk through some of the, I think, more qualitative findings.
Yeah, so I'll kind of whiz through these last set of slides. So we were asking people about how these schemes were actually impacting the household finances, and many were just so shocked at how much the council tax reduction dropped when they'd moved from being unemployed into work. So some examples, we had people who were getting over £1,000 off a council tax bill. The amount fell to £300 per month when she moved into work, even though it was minimum wage and it was only part-time. And often this impacted on the level of arrears that people generated. So moving from work, sort of from unemployment into work, meant that their council tax arrears, which they may not have had previously, suddenly started to increase. Some people found that moving house from one local authority area to another made a massive difference to their entitlement. So we had somebody who, after moving, had to pay council tax of £148 a month, whereas previously she'd only been required to pay £60. But her income hadn't changed and her circumstances hadn't changed. It was just simply the fact that she was in a different scheme now. And then lots of examples of similar sets of circumstances, but very different amounts of entitlement. So one lone parent in a particular council taking home £500 a month didn't get any entitlement to council tax reduction. Another in very similar circumstances who earned a lot more, £1,900, actually got £109 council tax reduction. This is qualitative research, obviously, but work done by Institute of Fiscal Studies and Resolution Foundation have looked more broadly across the piece and found differences of up to £125 a month or £1,500 a year, which could have increased, in fact, in relation to what Karen was saying in how schemes have changed. So huge differences just simply based on where people live. And this was impacting in some cases on the decisions people were making around work, minimising their hours in order to maximise the support they get. Some people saying the best you can really do is minimum hours because that's how it balances really. Next slide, please. In terms of the interaction between council tax reduction and universal credit, again, as Karen has outlined, just moving from the legacy system to universal credit can make a big difference to what people get in their council tax, depending on which type of scheme and what kind of income is disregarded. So disability living allowance for children, PIP, which is previously disregarded in the legacy system, is now included in some schemes as income. There's also the issue of fluctuating earnings, or how earnings are measured in universal credit. Also, people whose earnings are on the edge of income bands, a substantial reduction in council tax reduction, or entirely losing it altogether. So an example here on a quote: I was on the cusp of a band, pushed me into less support. So earning £366, you get nothing. 365 and you get 25%. It's too inflexible. You need predictability. You need to be able to budget. And then just the fact that universal credit is assessed in arrears, council tax liability is calculated for the month ahead. So trying to actually work out what the liability is and how you pay for that is quite complex for people, especially when the amount that they were getting was changing every month. Some people being reissued with a letter 12 times in the year about changes in their entitlement. Next slide, please. So what can be done to reform council tax reduction? There are basically three key areas of policy change. If a localised system is retained, and obviously a lot of local authorities like having a localised system that they can input to and design to meet their local areas. But one way around that would be for greater mandating by central government to prescribe what income disregards, what earning disregards there are. So things like capital limits, support for disabilities, caring and childcare in particular. These things could be mandated to create greater consistency and fairness across the piece. And also reducing the risk of legal challenges. Karen has highlighted the fact that some local authorities are doing this anyway to reduce the likelihood of legal challenges. But if central government were to mandate these things, there would be greater consistency across the piece. Having said that, still a lot of complexities around how to deal with the differences in income banded schemes. Another option would be to reintroduce a national scheme, which was designed by central government but administered locally in the same way as, or in a similar way to, council tax benefit. This is obviously going to give rise to winners and losers among claimants, depending on how generous the scheme was in or is in their local area. And obviously some local authorities are just concerned that a new national scheme would be less generous than the one that they're currently offering. The issue here is that the scheme is likely to be more expensive than the current localised system as well. The option of fully integrating council tax reduction into universal credit has been floated by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Excuse me. And what this would do would help to smooth the withdrawal of support as income rises, instead of having these step changes and cliff edges, which would help to improve work incentives. It would also mean that applications would be automatic when somebody claimed universal credit, so that would help to increase take-up, and also the administrative burden faced by claimants and councils. But there are still a lot of questions around how could this actually be done administratively and technically. And as Marsha mentioned as well, there's a huge risk of non-payment here once any entitlement goes into a universal credit award, similar to how the housing element was. Certainly in the first few years of universal credit, a lot of those housing payments created arrears for claimants, and a similar thing could happen in this case. So quite a lot of concern by local authorities and also claimants about being able to pay their council tax if it was absorbed within a bigger payment of universal credit. So next slide, I think, please. Great. So further work is definitely needed to flesh out these different options, and in particular how the financial impacts actually work in relation to the work incentives for claimants. But in the short term, what would help would be a greater automation of applications for the councils that have not already done so, and also better alignment between council tax reduction and universal credit policies. So, for example, around capital limits and disregards. And then an expansion in the data that the DWP provide to councils. At the moment, they only get information about new claims, not existing. And then as a medium-term objective, perhaps reverting to a more nationalised system. And then longer term, looking at how universal credit could potentially be integrated within universal credit. Ultimately, though, to have a fair and consistent system that protects the poorest and most vulnerable, that offers decent work incentives, and that is simple and efficient. Basically, it just needs to be properly funded. So an appropriate level of funding, an increase in the level of funding in reality is going to be required. Just on all my slides by 12. So the final slide, just to remind you that the report is coming out in a couple of weeks if you just keep looking online for that, but we will include people on mailing lists. Thank you for listening, and any questions?
Thank you very much, Rita. I should say, look, it is 12 o'clock. If anyone needs to go, obviously go, but we'll carry on for another 5 or 10 minutes to see if we have got any questions, and I will try and stop sharing. So Sharon, you've had your hand up for a long time. Hopefully we can unmute you and you can go ahead and ask a question. If you try, Sharon. There you go. Allowed your microphone. You should be able to speak now, I hope. If you unmute yourself, Sharon, I think you'll be able to speak. I can't hear you, Sharon. I'm just going to now look in the chat to see if anyone had any ones in the chat, or if anyone else has got any questions. Oh, look, I've got two Sharons. I've got a Sharon from Macmillan and a Sharon. Let me just unmute you. Oh no, there you go. Allowed microphone. So Sharon Watkins, do you want to ask your question? You might need to unmute your microphone.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Yeah, I did try and post it in the Q&A, but I don't know if it went in for some reason. So just two questions. Obviously arrears are going to increase, which means liability orders are going to be issued. We know with the consequence of a liability order, if an arrangement is not agreed and maintained, there will be an ultimate to go to bailiffs, which we know they all do. With that comes additional costs. Do we know from a local authority point of view if anybody has actually reconsidered their enforcement policy and diluted maybe the ultimate liability order versus forwarding on to bailiff action?
It wasn't something that we looked at directly in our research, Sharon, but we certainly did have people that were being taken to court, so they were having enforcement actions. I think local authorities do vary, but some of them will only agree a payment plan if people actually go to court, which again increases the amount of arrears. As you know, every time somebody goes to court, it increases the amount of arrears that that residents are required to pay. So it is definitely something that needs to be looked at in terms of kind of relaxation of these issues. But as I say, we didn't cover the sort of local authority end in any detail.
No, that's fine. It's just because, I mean, I work as a money guidance officer at Clarion, and it is very typical to speak to somebody who's had liability order after liability order issued year after year. So as you said in one of your earlier slides, you know, you're paying the charges from the previous year to then have the charges attached to this year. And then, you know, some people are quite maverick about what they think about a bailiff, but ultimately we do know that there are, you know, they can do the seizures, they can also, the local authority can go for an attachment of earnings. And also, we also know that ultimately a custodial can be issued. So that was my question on that. That'd be interesting to see if that does change. And then I had a second question. Obviously, in social housing, we see a lot of people. Well, people move, you know, but some people move because they have no choice. So they could be cuckooed, they could have fled domestic violence, trauma, fire, anything. Is there likely, do we think, any consideration for maybe a protection to be put in for people that are, you know, subject to that? So, for example, with, you know, there is a sanctuary scheme, isn't there, with housing costs, but is there going to be anything similar like for domestic violence and trauma and some of the examples I've just given, where people have to move and they have to go to a new property, generally in a new area, because they need to remove themselves from the association of the former area, and they could end up in one of these schemes where they are much more at a disadvantage?
Yeah, I mean, again, we didn't go into that level of detail, but this is, you know, this is an area again that if you had a national scheme, it wouldn't arise because moving areas wouldn't make any difference to your entitlement. Or the government actually mandating local authorities to make these changes to their schemes so it doesn't disadvantage vulnerable people in these situations. At the moment, it's just a free-for-all. It just depends on which local authority area you happen to be in and how responsive they are to these kinds of issues locally. Obviously, some areas are more responsive than others. But as I said, such issues wouldn't arise if you had a national scheme.
Yeah.
It would be interesting actually to look at what happens in Scotland and Wales, because of course they have their own national schemes. I'm just not familiar enough. It might be something that Karen knows more about, perhaps.
Yeah, I was just thinking from looking through, obviously we look at all the scheme documents that we have access to each year, and there's no specific protections within there for these circumstances that you're mentioning here. So the case would be that most have discretionary funds, their Section 13 relief, and if you found yourself unable to meet your liability because of a extenuous circumstance, then you could apply to their discretionary fund. Most local authorities don't publicise their Section 13 relief fund and how to apply for it. So whether you would know how to do so in your area is another matter.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point because, yeah, I mean, I've worked in benefits for years and I've never ever seen a local authority openly publish it or advertise it or even discuss it. Sometimes you do get it on occasion, but I mean, it's always been on occasion. But no, thank you very much for answering my questions.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Just briefly, Karen, there's on the Q&A about the benefit cap question there earlier. I don't know whether any of that needs commenting on. I think it's to do with
I
the
had a look. I
value
think it's the same
cap.
question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we talked about.
But what you're saying, whether the benefit cap can be treated differently in different areas depending whether it's an allowable deduction, is what I learned from that, which I didn't know before. Okay, has anyone else got any other questions? I'm not seeing any other hands up or chat, and we have gone beyond the time. Okay, thanks very much everyone for carrying on just that little bit longer. Thank you to Karen for that. We will send out Karen's slides and Rita and Marsha's slides after this together with the recording. We've got more documents available. If you do want them, contact Karen, and with Rita and Marsha's report, we'll make sure that you are able to contact everyone here in order to alert them to when your full report comes out, Rita and Marsha. And thank you once again for presenting that really, really useful research. And thank you very much to everyone for coming. We'll say goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.